It was September of 1885, out in the Montana Territory. A young woman named Clara Hensley found herself standing all alone on a splintered plank platform. She watched the westbound train get smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the mountains, which seemed to swallow the last bit of the setting sun. Her fiancé, the man who had promised her absolutely everything, had just walked away, leaving her with nothing but a suitcase, a made-up excuse, and not one single dollar in her pocket. The station agent locked the door behind him, and the darkness came on fast in that wild country. She had no place to go, no money, and no one to turn to, just a feeling of shame that burned hotter than the tears on her cheeks. And then, a shadow seemed to pull away from the sunset, and a stranger's voice asked the simple question that would change her entire life. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Before we dive into Clara's incredible story of being abandoned and finding her way, please take a second to hit that like button and comment with your city. I would love to see how far this story travels. Now let us go back to that September evening in the Montana Territory, where a school teacher from Chicago was having the worst day of her life, which turned out to be the start of a journey she never could have imagined. That platform felt like she was standing at the very edge of the world. Clara Hensley leaned her back against the rough wood of the station wall. Her knuckles were white from gripping the handle of her travel bag so tightly. She could still hear the echo of the train's whistle, even though the train itself had vanished into the mountain pass a full 20 minutes earlier. 20 minutes, that is how long she had been standing there, completely frozen, just waiting for the wave of panic to go down so she could think clearly. It never did. The September air had the sharp bite of early autumn, even though the day itself had been quite warm. She had quickly learned during her short time traveling west that out here in the Montana Territory, the temperature drops like a stone as soon as the sun begins to set. She pulled her traveling coat tighter around her shoulders, but the chill she felt had nothing at all to do with the weather. Grant was gone. This was the man she had followed halfway across the continent. He was the one who had charmed her back in Chicago with flowers, with poetry, and with grand promises of a brand new life in the West. Just an hour ago, he had looked her right in the eyes and lied. She saw the lie in the way his eyes darted away from hers and in the hard, tight line of his jaw. She heard it in how quickly he rushed through his excuse. "Clara, I am so terribly sorry. There has been an awful mix-up with the land claim. I have to go on ahead to Billings tonight. You understand, it must be tonight to get this all sorted out with the land office. You will be perfectly safe here. Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house just up the road. I will send word for you within a week, and we will be married the moment I get back." He had pushed a slip of paper into her hand with an address scribbled on it in a hurry. Then he climbed right back on that train before she could even think of what to say. The conductor had shouted the final call for boarding. The train had jerked forward, and just like that, Grant Caldwell was gone, heading toward a future that she was clearly not a part of. That piece of paper was still crumpled in her left hand. She slowly uncurled her fingers, staring at the ink that was already starting to smear from the sweat of her palm. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Willow Creek Road. There was no street number. There was no clue as to how far just up the road actually was. And even if she did find it, she had a grand total of 17 cents in her small purse. It was the very last of her travel money because Grant had insisted on holding her funds for safekeeping 2 weeks earlier when they were in Omaha. 17 cents was not going to get her a bed for the night. The station agent, a grizzled old man with whiskers stained from tobacco, had locked up his office 15 minutes ago. He had tipped his hat at her without saying a single word before he climbed onto a mule and headed off to the north. Across the rutted dirt road, the lights in the general store had gone out. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, and then it was quiet again. Clara glanced down at her traveling dress. It was a dove gray wool with black trim, very proper and modest, but completely useless for anything besides sitting on a train or in a fancy parlor. Her boots were made of thin leather, meant for city sidewalks. Her hat, which was now sitting a little crooked, was decorated with silk flowers that looked completely ridiculous under this vast, empty sky. She looked exactly like what she was, a foolish girl from the city who had put her trust in the wrong man. The shame of it all burned like acid in her chest. She had ignored every single warning. She remembered her mother's tight-lipped look of disapproval when Grant had proposed after they had only known each other for 3 months. She remembered her father's quiet suggestion that maybe they ought to wait a little while to get to know one another better. Even her best friend Margaret had her doubts. Clara, you do not really know him. What if things are different once you get out there? But Clara had been so certain. Grant was handsome, charming, and educated. He spoke of all the opportunity in the West, of building a life with meaning, of a true partnership where her skills as a teacher would be cherished in frontier towns that were desperate for educated women. He had made her feel important, chosen, and special. It was all a pack of lies, or maybe they were not lies exactly, but just a performance. It was a part he had played until he got what he wanted. And apparently what he wanted was not a wife, but a traveling partner who paid her own way and did not ask any hard questions until it was much too late to do anything about it. Clara's throat felt tight. She promised herself she would not cry again. She had already cried on the platform right after the train left, letting out hot, angry tears that did not solve a thing. She had cried in the station's outhouse, with quiet, desperate sobs that just left her eyes puffy and her head throbbing. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of any more of her tears. The sun finally touched the tops of the western peaks, painting them in shades of gold and amber. On any other day, she might have thought it was beautiful. But right now, it was just a reminder that darkness was coming, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. The sound of hoof beats on the dirt road made her stand up a little straighter, and her heart suddenly began to race. A rider was coming from the south, a dark silhouette against the fiery sunset. For one wild, foolish second, she thought, Grant came back for me. But as the horse got closer, she could see that this was not Grant's build or the way he sat a horse. This man sat in his saddle differently, more relaxed and deep, like he was born to it. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that kept his face in shadow, and his clothes were the kind a man works in, with a leather vest, a worn shirt, and chaps that were covered in dust from the trail. He pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet away from the platform, and the horse, a big roan gelding, tossed its head, sensing that its rider's attention had suddenly shifted. "Ma'am," the stranger said, his voice was low and steady. "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question, such a normal thing to ask, and yet it was the one thing that almost made her fall apart right there. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but then she closed it again. What could she possibly say? "No, I am not all right. I have been left behind. I am completely stranded. I am humiliated and terrified, and I only have 17 cents and nowhere to sleep tonight. I have no idea what to do." But instead, she said, "I am fine," and her voice sounded weak and fragile, even to her own ears. "Thank you for your concern." The man just looked at her for a long moment. Even with the light fading, she could tell he was not a young man, probably over 30, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his whole life working outdoors. His eyes were careful and thoughtful, but they did not seem unkind. "Station is closed," he stated simply. "Yes." "Last train heading west already passed through." "Yes." "Are you waiting on someone?" The question just hung there in the cool air between them. Clara could feel her face getting hot with embarrassment. She could lie. She could try to hold on to what little dignity she had left. She could pretend that she had a plan, a destination, and a very good reason for standing all by herself on this empty platform as night began to settle over the valley. Or she could just tell the truth. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am not waiting for anyone." The stranger's expression did not change, but she saw something in the way he held himself relax just a little bit, as if he had been waiting for her to finally admit the very thing he had already figured out. He swung down from his horse in one smooth, easy motion, leaving the reins to trail on the ground, confident his horse would stay put. Now that he was closer, Clara could see the details of his face. She saw the thin white scar that cut right through his left eyebrow, and the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and the wind. She saw the calluses on his hands, which were visible even from several feet away. He was not handsome in the same polished, perfect way that Grant had been, but there was something solid and dependable about him. He was not asking her to trust him, but somehow he made her feel like she could. My name is Luke Mercer, he said. I run a cattle ranch about 8 miles east of here. Clara just nodded, not sure what she was supposed to say to that. I do not mean to get into your personal business, Luke went on, his voice still careful and even. But I have got two younger sisters back in Kansas. And if I ever found out that one of them was standing all alone on a train platform at sundown in the middle of nowhere, well, I would hope that somebody would stop and check on her. The simple kindness in his voice was almost her undoing. Clara blinked her eyes quickly, staring at the darkening sky just past his shoulder. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Mercer. I will be fine. Are you heading to Mrs. Patterson's place? Her eyes snapped right back to his face. He gave a slight nod toward the crumpled piece of paper she was still holding in her hand. That is the address for the boarding house, he said. But it is 4 miles up a bad road, and she closed her doors for good last spring after her husband passed away. The house has been sitting empty since May. His words hit her like a physical blow. Clara felt the platform seem to shift beneath her, though she knew it was just in her head. Her last fragile bit of hope, as small as it had been, just vanished into thin air. I see, was all she could manage to say. Luke watched her, his expression steady. Ma'am, I do not know what has happened to you, and you certainly do not owe me any explanations. But the sun is setting fast, and that chill in the air is only going to get worse. You cannot stay here at the station. It has no heat, no water, and they have already locked the doors. He took a breath. I have a bunkhouse full of ranch hands, but there is also an extra room in the main house for my housekeeper. Mrs. Dorsey has been with me for 15 years, and she is very particular about how her house is run. If you are in need of a place for the night, a safe place, I can offer it to you. Clara just stared at him. Everything she had ever been taught about being a proper lady, about the dangers that strange men posed, and about guarding her own reputation, was screaming at her that this was out of the question. She could not just go off by herself with a man she had just met to some ranch hidden away in the mountains. But what other option did she have? Sleep right here on the platform? Try to walk 4 miles in the pitch dark to a house that was never there? Go knocking on doors in a town where she knew no one, asking strangers to take her in? Luke seemed to understand what she was thinking. I know what this must look like, he said softly, but I give you my word, you will be treated with nothing but respect. Mrs. Dorsey will make sure you are comfortable, and in the morning, if you decide to go back to town or do something else, I will drive you there myself. There are no strings attached, and no expectations. Why would you do this for me? The words came out sounding harsher than she meant them to. You do not know who I am. No, Luke had to agree, but I know trouble when I see it. And I also know I will not be able to sleep well tonight if I just ride away and leave you here. The simple truth in his words broke through all of Clara's defenses. She glanced down at her travel bag, then at her city clothes that were so wrong for this place, and at the piece of paper with the worthless address. She remembered the look on Grant's face while he lied to her, thought about the long trip out west, and how full of hope she had been just that morning. She realized how completely and utterly wrong she had been about absolutely everything. She was in no position to be proud. All right, she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Thank you. Luke gave a single nod and then pointed toward his horse. You can ride. I will walk. I could not possibly do that. It is a good 8 miles, ma'am, and you have on dress boots. I am wearing proper trail boots, and I walk much farther than this just checking my fence lines. It is no trouble at all for me. Before she could even argue, he had picked up her bag and tied it behind his saddle like he had done it 1,000 times before. Then he offered his hand to help her up onto the horse. Clara paused for only a second before she put her hand in his. His grip was strong and warm, and he lifted her onto the saddle so easily it was clear he had done this countless times. She adjusted her skirts to be as modest as she could while Luke took the reins and started walking east, toward the prairie that was growing darker by the minute. They moved without talking for the first mile or so. The horse had a smooth, easy way of walking. In spite of everything that had happened, Clara started to notice how beautiful the country was. She saw how the last bit of sunlight was painting the grasslands in shades of copper and gold, the stark outline of the mountains against a purple sky, and just how huge and open everything was. Chicago had been all buildings and constant noise, with crowds of people always pushing in on you. This was wide open space and deep silence, with air so fresh and clean, it was almost a shock to breathe it in. Are you from back east? Luke finally asked, his voice calm and conversational. Chicago, Clara replied. That is a long way to travel. Yes, he did not press her for more information. He did not ask the questions that were probably on his mind, like why she was all alone or what had brought her out west to begin with. The fact that he was not questioning her was almost more unsettling than if he had. Clara heard herself breaking the silence, even though she knew she probably should not. I was supposed to be married, she said, keeping her eyes on the horse's ears. My fiancé told me he had a piece of land out here, that we were going to build a new life. He was supposed to meet me at the station this afternoon. And she let her voice fade, not knowing how to say the rest. And he just left you there, Luke finished for her, his voice low. He told me he had some business in Billings, that he would send a message. Clara's grip on the saddle horn grew tighter. But he is not coming back for me, is he? Luke did not say anything for a moment, and the only sound was his boots on the hard-packed dirt of the trail. I do not know the man, ma'am, so I cannot say for sure. But if he left you at a closed station with no money and did not even check if you had a safe place to go, he just shook his head. Well, that says a whole lot about the kind of man he is. His directness should have hurt, but instead Clara felt a strange sense of relief. He offered no empty reassurances, no false hope, just the plain truth spoken without any meanness. I was such a fool, she said. You put your trust in someone. There is nothing foolish about that. It is foolish if you choose to ignore all the signs that something is wrong. Luke looked up at her, and his face was thoughtful in the fading light. Perhaps, or perhaps you just saw the thing you wanted to see because facing the alternative was just too painful. A lot of people do that. It does not make you a fool. It just makes you human. They continued to walk. The stars started to appear, shining brighter than any stars Clara had ever seen before. They formed a huge, glittering blanket across a sky that felt impossibly big. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, and something else, something wild and pure that she had never smelled in the city. What will you do now? Luke asked after some time. I do not know, Clara had to admit. I was a school teacher back in Chicago. I suppose I will have to find some kind of work and write to my parents to let them know that I am. She could not bring herself to finish that thought either, that I am stranded, that the man I was going to marry abandoned me, that I was so desperate to get away from my boring life that I followed a man I barely knew into the middle of nowhere, and now my life is ruined. Folks in Willow Creek do not have a proper schoolhouse, Luke said. The town is just too small. The few families that have children either teach them at home or send them down to the mission school, which is about 20 miles south. He was quiet for a second. But if you are looking for work while you get your bearings, I could always use another hand at the ranch. Clara looked down at him, surprised. Mr. Mercer, I could not. It is nothing improper, he said right away. Mrs. Dorsey runs the house and cooks for the hands. But for months now, she has been telling me she needs help with all the canning and the laundry and the 100 other tasks she says are too much for one person. She is 63 and has more pride than anyone I know. But her back is not what it once was. He looked directly into Clara's eyes. It is honest work, and it includes a room and meals. The pay is not a fortune, but it would be enough for you to save up if you decide you want to move on later. Are you offering me a job? Clara could hardly process what he was saying. You have no idea if I can cook or clean or do any of the things you would need. Can you learn? Yes, I imagine so. Then that is all that matters. Luke's voice was simple and direct. Look, I am not offering you charity. I have a need for help, and you have a need for work. Mrs. Dorsey will show you what to do. She is a fair woman to work for, strict, but she is not unkind. Shh. The ranch hands are all good men, but they know the rules. If anyone shows you the slightest disrespect, they will have to deal with me. He stopped for a moment. And if you find you do not like it, or it is not what you thought it would be, you are free to go anytime you please, no strings attached. Clara felt a lump form in her throat again. Why are you being so good to me? Luke was silent for such a long time that She began to think he was not going to answer her. When he finally did, his voice was quieter, and he almost sounded hesitant. About 5 years ago, my younger sister, Lily, found herself in a bad situation with a man who made a lot of promises he never planned on keeping. She was only 17 and she believed she was in love. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. She did not tell any of our family what was happening until it was nearly too late. By the time she finally made it home, she was rail thin and desperate, and she was so ashamed she could not even look us in the eye. His jaw grew tight. She is all right now. She married a good man and has two beautiful children. But she almost was not all right because that coward left her in a town where she did not know a single person, and it took her weeks to find the courage to ask for help. He looked up at Clara, and in the faint starlight, she could see the fierce, protective look on his face. So now, when I see a lady stranded at a station with nobody coming for her, I think of my sister, and I have to stop. Clara had to turn her head away, blinking rapidly. "Thank you," she whispered. They walked on in a comfortable quiet. After another mile, she saw lights up ahead, like warm yellow squares glowing in the blackness. As they got nearer, Clara could start to see the shapes of buildings. A big ranch house with a long porch, a few smaller buildings, a barn, and a corral. Lanterns were hanging on posts, creating pools of soft golden light. Smoke was curling up from the chimney of the main house, and the smell of cooking meat made Clara realize she had not had a single bite to eat since that morning. Luke led the horse over to the main house, where a short, sturdy woman was standing on the porch with her hands on her hips, her shape outlined by the light from the open doorway. "Luke Mercer, where in the world have you been?" she called out. "Supper was ready a half hour ago, and the boys are starting to get fidgety." "Sorry, Mrs. Dorsey," Luke said as he helped Clara down from the horse. "I was held up in town." Mrs. Dorsey walked down the porch steps. When she stepped into the light from the lantern, Clara could see a weathered face with piercing blue eyes and gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. The housekeeper looked once at Clara, at her fancy city clothes, her tired face and her clear state of distress, and her stern expression instantly softened. "Good heavens," she said in a low voice. "Child, you look like you are about to fall over. Mrs. Dorsey, this is Miss Hensley. She has had a very difficult day and needs a place to stay for the night." Luke's voice was real steady, giving nothing away. "I was hoping we might have a spot for her." Mrs. Dorsey's eyes cut over to Luke, and some kind of silent message passed between them. Then she looked back at Clara and gave a sharp little nod. "Well, of course we have room. Get on inside, child. You look chilled to the bone." She took Clara's arm and her grip was surprisingly soft. "Have you had any supper?" "No, ma'am. That ain't nothing we can't fix. Luke, you take her bag to the spare room, then go tell the boys supper's on in 10 minutes. I don't want them stomping in here while Miss Hensley is trying to get her bearings." She was already leading Clara up the porch steps. "Now, honey, let's get you warmed up and with some food in your belly, and then we can find you something better to wear than that old traveling dress." Clara just let herself be led, too tired and rattled to argue. The house was warm and smelled of fresh bread, roasting meat, and strong coffee. They walked through a sitting room with heavy furniture and a brick fireplace, then down a little hall to a small bedroom. The room was plain but spotless. A simple bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, one window with calico curtains, and a single wooden chair. After the awful day she'd had, the worry and the fear, this place felt like a heaven-sent refuge. "It ain't fancy," Mrs. Dorsey said, "but the sheets are clean and the mattress is sound. You'll rest easy enough." She looked at Clara with those piercing blue eyes. "Luke didn't say what happened, and I'm not one to pry, but you're safe here. Child, whatever mess you're running from, it don't cross this doorstep. You hear me?" Clara just nodded, afraid her voice would crack if she tried to speak. Mrs. Dorsey gave her arm a pat. "Good. Now you go on and wash up and come out to the kitchen when you're set. I'll have a plate waiting for you." She slipped out, closing the door quiet-like behind her. Clara just stood there in the middle of the room, her eyes not really seeing anything. Her traveling bag was on the chair where Luke must have set it down. Through the walls, she could hear the sounds of ranch life, men talking, boots on the floorboards, a burst of laughter, the clink of plates. She went to the washstand and poured some water from the pitcher into the bowl. It was cold, But it felt good as she scrubbed her face and hands, watching the dust from the road wash away. The little mirror over the stand showed a stranger. Her hair was a mess, her eyes were all red, and her face was pale with weariness. This very morning, she was Clara Hensley, a school teacher about to be a wife, heading toward a brand new life. Tonight, she was Clara Hensley, left behind and all alone, dependent on the kindness of folks she'd just met in a town she'd never seen before. But here was the funny thing. She was also warm, fed, and felt safe. Luke Mercer had seen her at her absolute worst and offered a hand without a lick of judgment. Mrs. Dorsey had taken her in, no questions asked. The pure terror that had a hold of her on that train platform had loosened its grip, and in its place was a tiny, shaky bit of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the start of something else entirely. Clara dried her face on the towel, smoothed her dress down the best she could, and drew in a long, deep breath. Then she opened that door and followed the sound of voices toward whatever was coming next. The kitchen was a sight bigger than Clara figured, with a huge iron stove against one wall and a long plank table that could seat a dozen men with room to spare. Mrs. Dorsey moved about the room like she'd been doing it for a lifetime, grabbing plates from a cupboard, ladling stew from a big pot, and cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread that let out steam with every cut. "Sit down," she ordered, pointing to a chair by the stove. "You look like you're about to fall flat on your face." Clara sank into the chair, so grateful for the warmth from that stove seeping right into her bones. She hadn't even noticed how cold she'd gotten on that platform, how the September night air had settled deep inside her. When Dorsey set a bowl of stew down, thick with beef and potatoes and carrots, smelling rich and wonderful. She added the bread and a mug of coffee. "Eat," Mrs. Dorsey told her. "We can talk later." Clara's hands were shaking as she picked up the spoon. That first taste was a miracle, so hearty and full of flavor, nothing at all like the dainty meals she was used to back in Chicago. She tried her best to eat slow and polite, but she was so hungry that she just couldn't help herself. In no time at all, her bowl was clean, and Mrs. Dorsey filled it right back up without a word. The back door creaked open, and in walked Luke, holding his hat. He'd cleaned up somewhere, his hair still a little damp around the edges. He gave Clara a nod, then looked to Mrs. Dorsey. "The boys are eating in the bunkhouse. I told them you'd send over some extra bread. It's already set aside." Mrs. Dorsey pointed to a covered basket next to the stove. "Tommy can fetch it in a bit." Luke leaned up against the counter, just watching Clara eat with that same quiet, steady way he'd had at the station. It ought to have made her nervous, but for some reason, it didn't. He wasn't judging her, just watching. "Miss Hensley," he said after a bit, "Mrs. Dorsey and I talked it over, and our offer still holds. If you're looking for work, you've got it here. Room and board, and $30 a month. You'd be helping Mrs. Dorsey with the house and cooking for the hands, doing the wash and mending, and helping put up food from the garden when it comes in. It's hard work, I won't lie, but it's honest work." Clara put her spoon down, her heart starting to beat like a drum. $30 a month. That wasn't much back in Chicago, but out here, with a roof over her head and food on the table, she could save nearly all of it. In 6 months, she'd have enough money to go somewhere new, to start fresh, maybe even find a proper teaching job in a bigger town. "I don't know the first thing about ranch work," she said honestly. "Neither did I when Luke brought me on," Mrs. Dorsey said with a dry little smile. "I was selling fancy hats to city ladies back in St. Louis. But you learn, and you will too. The only thing that matters is if you're willing to put in the work and listen to what you're told." "I am," Clara said, "maybe a little too fast. I want to earn my place. I won't be a burden." Mrs. Dorsey's face seemed to soften just a little. "You're no burden, child. You're help we sorely need. My back ain't been right since I took that tough spell last winter, and this place has more chores than I can get to on my own. Luke should have brought on some help months back, but he is mighty particular about spending money on what he considers fluff." She gave Luke a sharp glance. "It is not fluff when you are in a bind," Luke answered calmly. "I just did not want to hire someone who would create more trouble than they were worth. But this Miss Hensley, she seems like a capable woman." "How could you possibly say that?" Clara questioned. "You have only known me for a couple of hours." Luke thought on it for a moment. You did not lose your composure up on that platform. You could have. A lot of folks would have. Instead, you kept your wits about you, made the difficult decision to trust a stranger, and now you are sitting right here asking for a job instead of feeling sorry for yourself. That speaks volumes to me. His assessment was so straightforward, without a trace of pity or judgment, that Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. She blinked them away with determination. I will work hard, she stated. I promise you will not be sorry you hired me. Then it is settled. Luke stood up straight. Mrs. Dorsey will walk you through the daily tasks tomorrow. For now, you just get some rest. It has been a whoop-wound day for you. He went out the back door, and Clara could hear his boots walking across the yard toward the bunkhouse. Mrs. Dorsey finished tidying the kitchen with a swift and practiced hand, and Clara got up to help, even though she was worn out. Just sit yourself down, Mrs. Dorsey said with authority. You will have plenty of work starting tomorrow. Tonight, you are our guest. But Clara could not keep still. She started gathering the plates, taking them over to the wash basin, and moving about the kitchen, looking for ways to make herself useful. Mrs. Dorsey watched her for a second, then let out a sigh. So you are one of those types, are you? The kind that cannot sit down until every last thing is done. I only want to be helpful, Clara said in a low voice. You have both been so good to me, and You stop that right now, Mrs. Dorsey's voice was soft but unyielding. Kindness is not a debt that needs repaying, child. People help each other sometimes because it is the proper thing to do. You will come to understand that out here. We look out for one another because this land does not forgive carelessness, and staying alive means relying on your neighbors. Now, if you are set on being useful, I will wash and you can dry. But after that, you are heading to bed, and I will not take no for an answer. They worked side by side in a comfortable quiet. Clara fell into the rhythm of the simple chore, the warm water, and the stacking of clean dishes. It was a normal domestic task that felt strangely calming after the day's turmoil. How long have you been working for Mr. Mercer? Clara eventually asked. 15 years. I came to this place when Luke was just getting the ranch started. He was hardly 23 years old. The land was passed down from his uncle, and he had more ambition than good sense. Those first few years were lean. We almost lost it all on 2 occasions. One time to a drought and another to a brutal winter that took half the cattle. But Luke, he has got a strong spine. He does not back down when the going gets tough. He mentioned having sisters, 2 of them, both living back in Kansas. Fine girls. Lily is the one who had some trouble for a while. She ended up marrying a good man. Sarah is still at the family home, helping their mother. Luke sends them money when he is able, even though they would never ask him for a dime. Mrs. Dorsey handed Clara another plate. He is a good man. Quiet and keeps his thoughts to himself, but he is fair. The ranch hands respect him because he works harder than any of them and would never ask a man to do a job he would not tackle himself. Is he... Clara paused. Is he married? Mrs. Dorsey's gaze sharpened just a bit, but her tone stayed even. No, he came close one time about 7 years ago. A young woman from town named Rebecca, a pretty thing, had some schooling. It seemed like a fine match, but she could not take the loneliness of being so far out here. She stayed for 6 months before heading back east to marry a banker. She wiped her hands on her apron. Luke never speaks of it, but it left a mark on him. It made him more cautious, I reckon, less inclined to believe someone will stick around when things turn hard. Clara took this in, understanding more than she wished she did. Luke Mercer also knew what it felt like to be left. That shared experience forged a surprising connection in her mind. They finished the dishes. Mrs. Dorsey gave Clara a tour of where everything was stored. Linens were in the hall closet, lamps and oil were in the pantry, and the washroom had a copper tub and a pump. The house was very orderly, with a place for everything, all kept up with the pride of someone who values their work. We get up at 5, Mrs. Dorsey explained as they headed back to Clara's room. Breakfast for the men is at 6 o'clock sharp. Coffee, eggs, bacon, and biscuits. They are out in the fields by 7 o'clock. The noon meal is dinner, and supper is at 6 o'clock in the evening. Between meals, we have a schedule. Monday is for washing, Tuesday is for ironing, Wednesday is for baking, Thursday is for mending, and Friday is for deep cleaning. Saturdays are for catching up on whatever needs doing, and Sundays are for rest with just simple meals and the essential chores. Clara's mind was spinning as she tried to commit it all to memory. Mrs. Dorsey gave a faint smile. Do not you worry, you will get the hang of it. The first few weeks always feel like a whirlwind, but it all becomes second nature before you know it. She stopped at the door to Clara's room. There are a couple of rules you ought to know. The ranch hands are decent men, but they are men all the same, and you are a young woman living close by. You will treat them with respect, and they will do the same, but you must maintain a proper distance. You are not to go to the bunkhouse by yourself. You are not to invite any special favors or attention, and you are not to create any situation that could be taken the wrong way. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Good. Luke will make that clear to the men as well. You are here to do a job, and that is all. Anyone who forgets that will have to answer to him, and Luke has no patience for foolishness. Mrs. Dorsey's face softened. Now, is there anything you need tonight? My room is just down the hall. Do not be shy about knocking if something is amiss. Thank you, Clara said, for all of it. I do not know how to. No thanks are needed. Get some rest, child. Tomorrow will be a long one. Clara went into her room and shut the door, leaning her back against it as a powerful wave of exhaustion washed over her. She changed into her nightgown with automatic motions, took the pins out of her hair, and slipped into bed. The mattress was firm, the quilt was heavy and warm, and the sheets had a faint scent of lavender. She expected to lie awake for hours thinking over the day's calamities, feeling ashamed and uncertain. But instead, sleep took hold of her almost immediately, pulling her down into a darkness more profound than any she had ever experienced. She was woken by a firm knock on her door, and the morning sun shining through the calico curtains. Clara sat bolt upright, confused, her heart racing. Miss Hensley, it is 5 o'clock. Time to rise and shine. Mrs. Dorsey's voice was energetic but not harsh. 5 o'clock. Back in Chicago, Clara had almost never been up before 7. She quickly put on her most practical dress, a plain brown cotton that felt terribly unsuitable for ranch work, and pinned her hair up with trembling hands. By the time she opened her door, Mrs. Dorsey was no longer there, but she could hear sounds of activity coming from the kitchen. Clara rushed down the hallway. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Dorsey moved with a seasoned grace. The stove was already hot, bacon was sizzling in a huge skillet, and coffee was brewing in a pot big enough to serve a small army. She looked over at Clara and gestured with her head toward a basket of eggs. Do you know how to crack eggs? Yes, ma'am. Good. I need 3 dozen. The bowls are over there. Try not to let any shells fall in. The men get fussy about it. Clara got started, cracking eggs into a large ceramic bowl. Her hands recalled the movement from helping her mother many years ago before her life was consumed by teaching. Crack, separate. Let the contents drop into the bowl. Toss the shell. She repeated the motion over and over until the bowl was filled with golden yolks floating in clear whites. Beat them, Mrs. Dorsey instructed, passing her a whisk. Make them nice and frothy. Clara whipped the eggs while Mrs. Dorsey got out the flour and began making biscuits. Clara worked the dough with an easy rhythm that came from long practice. The whole kitchen was filled with comforting smells. There was coffee brewing, bacon sizzling, and that warm, yeasty scent of bread on the rise. Mrs. Dorsey pointed to a pan and said, Pour the eggs right in there. Scramble them up good now. You have to keep them moving so they do not stick to the bottom. Clara had cooked before, of course, but never for 15 hungry ranch hands. The sheer size of the job was intimidating. She found herself scrambling eggs in a pan big enough to give a small child a bath. She watched nervously as they started to cook, stirring and stirring to keep them light and fluffy. That's good, Mrs. Dorsey said, looking over Clara's work. You have got some decent instincts. Go on and pull them off the heat now. They will just keep on cooking in that hot pan if you leave them too long. By 6 o'clock, the long wooden table was heavy with platters of eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits, and gravy. Mrs. Dorsey rang a loud bell next to the back door, and in just a few minutes the men started filing inside. They were weathered, hard-working men who took off their hats and washed their hands at the basin by the door before they sat down. Luke came in last of all, giving Clara a small nod. Miss Hensley, I hope you slept well. I did, thank you very much. The men ate with the kind of focused energy you only see in people who burn a mountain of calories doing hard physical work. Clara stood by the stove with Mrs. Dorsey, refilling the platters as soon as they were empty, pouring fresh coffee, and bringing out more biscuits. The hands were polite, always saying, "Thank you, ma'am," and "much obliged." But their real attention was on their food and the long day of work ahead. One of the younger men, who could not have been more than 20 years old, Marlozo, caught Clara's eye and gave her a shy smile. Luke's voice cut right across the room, sharp and immediate. "Tommy, you have work to do." The young man's face turned bright red, and he immediately stared down at his plate. The message could not have been clearer. Clara was off limits. The other men had already figured this out, but it seemed Tommy needed a reminder. After breakfast, the hands all filed back outside, and Clara helped Mrs. Dorsey clean up the mountain of dirty dishes. Her hands were sore and red from the hot water by the time they were done, and it was barely 8 in the morning. "Now we get started on dinner," Mrs. Dorsey announced. "We are having roast beef today, so it needs to go in the oven soon if it is going to be ready by noon. We will need potatoes, carrots, and bread. Do you know how to knead dough?" "I can learn how." And she certainly did learn. Mrs. Dorsey was a patient teacher, but she was also very precise. She would show Clara how to do something one time and then expected her to repeat the technique perfectly. Knead the dough until it feels elastic. Peel the potatoes in one long, continuous strip to avoid waste. Check on the roast every half hour. Keep the coffee pot hot because the men will wander in for a cup at all hours of the day. By noon, Clara's feet ached and her back was screaming in protest. But dinner was on the table. The men came in, ate their fill, thanked them, and left. Clara and Mrs. Dorsey cleaned everything up again, then started preparing the vegetables for supper. In the afternoon, Mrs. Dorsey showed Clara how to make a perfect pie crust. The secret, she said, is cold butter and a light hand. They made 3 beautiful apple pies for dessert. At 6 o'clock, the men came back for supper. It was more food, more dishes, and more coffee. By the time the kitchen was finally clean and the men had gone to the bunkhouse for the night, Clara was so tired she could hardly stand up straight. "You did a good job today," Mrs. Dorsey said kindly. "Better than I was expecting for your first day. Now you get some rest. Tomorrow is washing day, which means you will be hauling water from the pump. You are going to need your strength." Clara stumbled back to her small room, collapsed right onto the bed with her clothes still on, and fell asleep in an instant. The days began to blur together into a steady rhythm of exhausting work. Washing day meant hauling bucket after bucket of cold water from the pump, heating it all on the big stove, then scrubbing clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. After that, she had to wring them out and hang them on the line to dry. Ironing day meant heating heavy flat irons on the stove and pressing what felt like an endless pile of shirts and trousers. Baking day meant she had to get up even earlier to start the bread before breakfast. Mending meant she sat by the lamplight after supper, squinting at tiny stitches until her eyes burned. But Clara was learning. She learned how to judge the oven's temperature by how fast a drop of water sizzled on its surface. She learned how to carry 3 plates at one time without dropping a single one. She learned which of the hands liked their coffee black and which one wanted extra sugar. She learned to move around the kitchen efficiently, guessing what Mrs. Dorsey would need before she even had to ask. She also learned about the ranch itself. Luke ran a big cattle operation with about 1,500 head of cattle spread out across several thousand acres. The hands were a mix of older, experienced cowboys and younger men who were still learning the trade. They worked brutal hours during roundup season, but things were a little easier in the winter. They all respected Luke because he paid them fair wages, gave them good food, and treated them like men instead of disposable help. "A lot of ranchers out here will work their hands to death and could not care less if they quit," Mrs. Dorsey explained one afternoon while they were canning tomatoes. "Luke figures it is smarter to treat people well and keep good men around. It costs less in the long run than always training new hands who do not know the land or the cattle." Clara saw very little of Luke during those first few weeks. He was always out before dawn, checking on the cattle, riding along the fence lines, and managing all the endless details of running such a large operation. When he did come in for meals, he was quiet, ate quickly, and then went right back to work. But she did notice the small things. She noticed the way he always thanked Mrs. Dorsey for the food. She saw how he checked to make sure Clara had everything she needed without making a big fuss about it. She noticed the careful distance he kept, which felt more protective than cold. 3 weeks after Clara arrived, a big storm rolled in from the west. Massive thunderheads turned the sky black by the middle of the afternoon. Mrs. Dorsey sent Clara out to bring in the laundry before it got soaked, and Clara ran to the clothesline just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. She was wrestling with sheets that were snapping like giant sails in the wind when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Luke rode in hard, his horse covered in sweat, and he dismounted in one smooth, fast motion. "Leave it," he shouted over the rising wind. "Get in safe here." "But the sheets will not matter if you get struck by lightning." Goy. Clara ran for the house just as the storm broke wide open, with rain coming down in blinding sheets. She made it to the porch just as a bolt of lightning cracked right overhead. The thunder was so loud it shook the windows in their frames. Behind her, Luke was leading his horse into the barn, moving right through the downpour as if it were just a light sprinkle. Inside the house, Mrs. Dorsey had the lamps lit and was closing all the shutters. "A storm like this, we could lose the electricity if we had any. It is a good thing we do not rely on such foolishness." She handed Clara a towel. "Dry yourself off before you catch your death." The storm raged for hours. The rain hammered on the roof and the wind howled around the corners of the house. The hands stayed in the bunkhouse, so supper was a simple meal. They had soup and bread, which they ate in the kitchen while the storm battered the world outside. Luke came in around 7 o'clock, soaked completely through despite his oilskin coat. He hung it by the door and accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Dorsey poured for him, standing by the stove to warm himself up. "We lost part of the fence in the north pasture," he said. "We will have to ride out tomorrow and check for any cattle that wandered off." Tommy spotted what looked like a washout near the creek, but it was getting too dark to see it properly. "You need some food," Mrs. Dorsey said, ladling soup into a big bowl. Luke sat down at the table, and Clara found herself sitting across from him almost without thinking about it. In the warm lamplight, she could see the lines of exhaustion on his face. She saw the way his shoulders were hunched just slightly, as if the weight of all his responsibility was a physical thing. "How are you settling in, Miss Clara?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I am learning," she said. "Mrs. Dorsey is an excellent teacher." "She keeps you busy enough?" "She keeps me busy enough that I fall asleep the moment my head hits the pillow." A faint smile touched Luke's face. That was the idea. Hard work keeps the mind from dwelling on things that cannot be changed. It was the first time he had acknowledged her situation since that very first night. Clara looked down at her hands. They were rougher now, with calluses forming where the washboard had rubbed her palms raw. "You were right," she said quietly, "about the work helping. I have been too tired to think much about before." Luke nodded his head slowly. "Give it time. Eventually you will be able to think about it without it hurting so much." "Did you?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. "With Rebecca, I mean. Mrs. Dorsey mentioned—" "I am so sorry. I should not have asked." But Luke did not look offended at all. "Eventually," and he said, "it took a lot longer than I wanted it to, but yes. There came a day when I could think about what happened without feeling like someone had kicked me right in the chest." He met her eyes from across the table. "You will get there too." The simple certainty in his voice made Clara's throat feel tight. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the house. But inside the kitchen, it felt warm and safe, like a little island of light and calm in the middle of all that darkness. They sat there in a comfortable silence, just listening to the rain. And Claire realized with some surprise that for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she felt something other than fear or shame or exhaustion. She felt almost at peace. October arrived, bringing with it a frost that painted the windows silver each morning and turned the prairie grass to gold. Clara had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and her body had adapted to the relentless physical demands in ways that surprised her. The city's softness had been worked right out of her hands, replaced by calluses. Her shoulders no longer cried out from hauling water, and she could work bread dough for a full 20 minutes before her arms even thought about quitting. The exhaustion was still there, a constant companion, but it was a familiar ache now, a satisfying reminder of every single dollar Luke placed in her hand at the end of the month. She had also started to figure out the men on the ranch. Tommy, the youngster who had smiled at her on that first morning, was the son of a Kansas wheat farmer, trying his hardest to make it as a true cattleman. He was all eagerness and fumbling hands, which earned him endless teasing from the older cowboys. Miguel, a man of few words from Mexico, was the finest horseman Clara had ever witnessed. He and his horse moved as one being. Then there was old Pete, who said he was 60 but looked a good deal older. He had been working cattle since before the war and could predict the weather with an accuracy that felt like old magic. And Luke, he was the biggest puzzle of all. He was always proper and polite, never asking for more than the job she was hired for, and kept a careful distance that felt both decent and a little bit lonely. Sometimes she would look up during supper and find him watching her with a thoughtful look, but he would always glance away the second their eyes met. The first snow arrived on a Thursday in late October, big wet flakes that vanished on the still warm earth. By Friday, the temperature had plunged 15 degrees, and Mrs. Dorsey was already planning to stock the root cellar before the deep freeze set in. "Winter out here is a different beast than in Chicago," she told Clara while they peeled potatoes for the evening meal. "We can get snowed in for a week, easy. We have to have enough food put back to see us through to spring." That afternoon, Luke came inside much earlier than usual, a grim set to his jaw. "The weather is turning," he announced. "There is a real bad storm blowing in from the north. Looks to be a monster." Mrs. Dorsey put down her paring knife. "How much time have we got?" "Maybe 2 days. 3, if we get lucky." "Well, you boys better get a move on. Pack extra food. If that storm is as mean as you say, you might get stuck up there." Luke gave a short nod and turned to go, but Clara found she was already on her feet. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He stopped and looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You know how to ride a horse?" "I learned when I was a girl. It has been a long time, but I remember the basics." A change came over Luke's face, a look of calculation. "Can you manage in rough country?" "I do not know," Clara said honestly, "but if you need another person, I am willing to try." Mrs. Dorsey made a sound of protest. "Luke, you cannot take her up into those mountains. She is not cut out for that kind of work." "I know." Luke's eyes were still fixed on Clara, and she could almost see him weighing his choices. "But we are short 2 men. Billy has a broken arm, and Sam is in Helena visiting his sick mother. If that storm rolls in before we get those cattle down, we could lose a third of the herd." He paused for a moment. "Miss Hensley, I will not sugarcoat it. The riding will be hard, the nights will be freezing, and it will be truly dangerous if the weather closes in on us. But if you are willing to risk it, I could surely use the help." Clara's heart began to pound against her ribs. Every sensible thought in her head screamed that this was a terrible idea. She had no place going into the mountains with a bunch of cowboys to chase cattle in front of a blizzard. But another part of her, a part that had been waking up over the past few weeks of honest labor, whispered that she was stronger than she knew. "I will go," she said, her voice clear. Mrs. Dorsey threw her hands in the air. "You are both out of your minds. Clara, you will catch your death of cold. Luke, if anything happens to her—" "Nothing is going to happen to her," Luke said, his tone firm. "I will keep her close and see that she is safe. But we need every available hand, and she has offered." He looked directly at Clara. "Gather your warmest things. We ride in an hour." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Dorsey, still grumbling about foolish young people, packed supplies with a grim determination. She packed dried beef, hard biscuits, coffee, and beans, wrapping it all in oilcloth and dividing it into saddlebags. Clara put on her most durable dress, only to realize how useless it would be. Mrs. Dorsey vanished for a moment and came back with a pair of men's trousers and a thick wool shirt. "Put these on. Being proper will not keep you from freezing, and you cannot ride a horse in a skirt." She then handed Clara a heavy coat that looked like it belonged to one of the ranch hands. "It is not fancy, but it is warm." Clara changed her clothes without hesitation, feeling strange in a man's attire, but also realizing how much more practical it was. She could finally move without being tangled in layers of fabric. Mrs. Dorsey braided her hair into a tight plait and pushed a wool cap down on her head. You listen to everything Luke tells you, she ordered fiercely. He knows these mountains like the back of his hand, and he will keep you out of trouble if you are smart enough to let him. But Clara, if it gets to be too much, you tell him. Your pride is not worth your life. I will, I promise, Clara replied. Outside, the cowboys were saddling their horses with practiced ease. Luke led a small brown mare with a white stripe down her nose over to her. This here is Daisy. She has got a good head on her shoulders and will not spook easy. Just hold the reins steady, but let her have her head. She knows this ground better than you do. He showed her how to get into the saddle and how to sit for a long ride. We will start out slow, let you get your bearings. But once we are on the trail proper, we have to push hard. Think you can do that? I will manage. Luke looked her over for a long second, then gave a single satisfied nod. I believe you will. They rode out as the afternoon sun began to dip low, a group of 6 riders heading northeast toward the mountains. Tommy, Miguel, Old Pete, a quiet man named Jack, Luke, and Clara. The pace was steady, not punishing, giving Clara time to remember the lessons from her youth. Heels down, sit up straight, move with the horse's rhythm, not against it. Her body seemed to recall the motions better than her mind did. After an hour, the stiffness left her, and she settled into Daisy's comfortable gait, the steady rocking motion almost lulling her. The landscape transformed around them, the painterant rolling prairie giving way to rougher country, dotted with pine trees as they gained elevation. They set up camp for the night as darkness fell, finding a spot sheltered by rocks and scrubby pines. Miguel had a fire crackling in no time while old Pete put on a pot of coffee. Clara helped Tommy with the saddles, and though her arms ached by the end, she did not say a word. The men moved about the camp with a quiet efficiency born from years of practice, each knowing his job without being told. Luke handed Clara a tin plate piled with beans and salted pork. Eat up, then get some rest. We are leaving before sunrise. The meal was simple, but it tasted wonderful, and Clara was so hungry she did not mind. After they finished eating, the men spread their bedrolls near the fire. Luke brought Clara an extra blanket and pointed to a spot a little away from the others. You can sleep here. It is warm from the fire, but you will have your privacy. If anyone gives you trouble, you just holler. I am not worried, Clara said, and she truly meant it. The men had shown her nothing but courtesy since her first day. Luke nodded. All the same, you call out if you need anything. She settled into her bedroll, feeling the hard ground beneath her and seeing more stars in the sky than she had ever dreamed of. The fire popped and hissed, and she thought she heard old Pete humming a low, unfamiliar song. Despite the biting cold, the strange new setting, and the certainty that tomorrow would be even more difficult, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She was doing something important, something real, that had nothing to do with being a proper lady. She drifted off to sleep with the sound of the horses shifting in the dark and the low murmur of the men's voices as they planned the next day's ride. Dawn arrived cold and gray. They were back in the saddles before the sun had even crested the mountains, climbing steadily into tougher country. The trees grew closer together, and the trail became narrow and steep. Clara's legs burned from gripping the saddle, and a dull ache settled in her lower back from the long hours. But she matched their pace without a single complaint. Around midday, they finally reached the high pasture where the cattle had spent the summer grazing. The herd was spread out across a wide meadow, maybe 300 head in all, looking fat and lazy. The job was to push them down to the lower lands before the storm buried them up here, where the snow would be too deep for them to find anything to eat. Luke divided them into pairs, sending them to different points around the herd. Clara was told to stick with him, watching as he skillfully separated small groups of cattle and started them moving downhill. He made it look effortless, but Clara soon discovered it was one of the hardest things she had ever done. The cattle had no desire to leave their peaceful meadow. They would scatter, turn back, and try to break for the open field. It required constant attention and lightning-fast reactions to keep the herd pointed in the right direction. "Push that cow, Luke!" Luke shouted, gesturing toward a contrary heifer that was about to make a break for it. "Do not let her get past you." Clara nudged Daisy forward, moving her horse to head off the stray. The cow gave an irritated snort and turned, trotting back to the main group. It was a small victory, but it felt like a giant one. They pushed on through the afternoon, gathering the scattered cattle bit by bit and funneling them toward the trail heading down the mountain. The work was exhausting, dusty, and full of frustration. Clara's arms burned from handling Daisy's reins. Her throat was raw from hollering at stubborn animals, and every single muscle in her body protested the long hours in the saddle. But she did not stop, and slowly, against all odds, they began to make real progress. By the time the sun began to set, they had the bulk of the herd moving downhill, a great river of beef winding along the narrow path. The ranch hands whooped and yelled, keeping the cattle packed tightly together to stop any from wandering off. Clara rode near Luke, watching how he did things and learning to see where trouble might start before it happened. "You are doing a good job," Luke told her during a quiet moment. "Better than I figured you would." "I am worn out," Clara confessed. "That is because you are putting your back into it. But you have not quit, you have not complained, and you have not fallen behind. That is what counts out here." They set up camp for the night in a box canyon. The cattle settled down for the night, with the hands taking turns on watch. Clara was so tired she could hardly manage the beans and bacon old Pete cooked up, but she made herself eat every bite. She knew she would need the energy come morning. Luke walked over to see how she was doing before she crawled into her bedroll. "How are you holding up? And I want the honest truth." "I have aches in places I never knew I had," Clara told him. "But I will be all right." A small smile touched his lips, a rare thing that completely changed his normally stern face. "I know you will. You are a whole lot tougher than you think you are." His words warmed her more than the campfire ever could. She got into her bedroll, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and let pure exhaustion pull her into a deep sleep. They were up and moving before the sun, pushing the herd hard as the sky began to look threatening. The wind kicked up, carrying the sharp scent of snow, and the air grew colder by the minute. Luke kept the pace fast, skipping their usual midday break. He was determined to get all the cattle down to the lower pastures before the storm hit full force. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Clara heard the sound of gunshots. The sharp cracks came from somewhere up ahead and to their left, echoing off the canyon walls. Luke stiffened in his saddle, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he's kept behind him. "Everybody stay calm," he said, and his voice had that tone of pure command that Clara had come to know well. "Keep the cattle moving. Miguel, Pete, you take the flanks. Tommy, Clara, you stick close to me. Jack, you watch our back trail." "What is happening?" Clara asked, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. "I would bet it is rustlers. They have been hitting ranches all summer long, stealing cattle when a storm rolls in to cover their tracks." Luke's jaw was set like stone. "They just picked the wrong day to mess with my herd." More shots rang out. They were closer this time. Clara could see figures moving through the trees. They were on horseback, maybe 4 or 5 of them, trying to split off a piece of the herd. Miguel rode hard to cut them off, his horse moving like a deer over the rocky ground. Luke pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "Clara, get yourself behind those rocks and you stay down. Do not you come out until I tell you to." This time, the command in his voice left no room for debate. Clara quickly dismounted and led Daisy behind a large cluster of boulders, her hands trembling as she tied the reins to a tough little pine tree. From her hiding spot, she could watch the whole scene unfold. Luke and his men were facing off against the rustlers, with the nervous cattle shifting between them. She could hear angry voices carried on the wind. Then more shots were fired, and the cattle started to panic, breaking into a full-blown stampede. The whole world turned into pure chaos. Men on horseback chased after running cattle, guns were firing, and shouts and curses filled the air. Clara flattened herself against the cold stone of the rocks, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Luke ride straight after the rustlers. She saw him raise his rifle and fire. She saw one of the thieves tumble from his horse. Another one turned and shot back, and for one heart-stopping second, Clara was certain Luke had been hit. But he kept on riding, never slowing down, chasing after them. Faced with his relentless pursuit, the rustlers broke and ran, giving up on their plan to steal the cattle. Luke and Miguel chased them for another quarter of a mile before they turned back, deciding it was better to let them go than to leave the herd unprotected. When Luke finally rode back to where Clara was waiting, she saw blood on his shoulder. It was not a lot, just a graze, but it was enough to make her stomach twist with fear. He got off his horse stiffly, and she saw him wince with pain. "You are hurt," she said. "It is nothing, just that a bullet grazed, that is all." But his face was pale and his movements were stiff and careful. "We have to keep moving. That storm is almost on top of us, and those rustlers might just decide to come back with friends." "Let me look at it first." "Miss Hensley, what?" "Let me look at it." Clara's voice was stronger than she ever knew it could be. "You can hardly even move that arm, and we have hours of riding still ahead of us. If that is not bandaged right, you could lose too much blood." Luke just stared at her for a long moment, then finally gave a small nod. Clara helped him take off his coat and shirt, trying her best not to stare at the hard muscle of his sun-darkened skin. The wound was not deep, but it was bleeding more than a little. She used water from her own canteen and a clean strip of cloth torn from her spare shirt to clean and wrap the injury, her hands surprisingly steady even though her heart was racing. "You have done this before," Luke said, watching her. "My father was a doctor. He taught me the basics of field medicine. He always said every person ought to know how to handle an injury when real help is a long way off." She tied the bandage tight. "That should hold until we can get back to the ranch and have Mrs. Dorsey clean it out properly." "Thank you." Luke's voice was low and his eyes were fixed on her face. "You did not panic back there. Most women would have. Most women have not spent 6 weeks learning they are capable of a lot more than they ever imagined." Clara looked right back at him. "You trusted me enough to bring me on this drive. I am not going to fall to pieces the first time things get a little rough." Something in Luke's face changed. It was recognition, it was respect, and it was something else that Clara did not have a name for. But before either of them had a chance to say another word, old Pete's voice boomed out, "Boss, the storm is here!" The first big snowflakes were already falling, coming down thick and fast. In just a few minutes, you could not see more than a few yards ahead, and the wind began to howl like a hungry animal. With Clara's help, Luke pulled his coat back on and swung himself up into the saddle. "We push hard now," he yelled over the wind. "No stopping until we are off this mountain. Everybody stay close. Do not lose sight of the person in front of you." They rode straight into the blizzard, driving the cattle ahead of them, battling the wind and the snow and the bitter cold. Clara kept her eyes locked on the shape of Luke's back, trusting Daisy to follow his horse. The entire world vanished into a swirl of white, with nothing visible past a few feet. The temperature dropped so fast that Clara's breath began to freeze on the scarf she had wrapped around her face. The hours all blended together into one long struggle. The cold worked its way through every layer of her clothes, making her fingers and toes go numb, and her body feel slow and heavy. The only reason the cattle kept moving was because the hands refused to let them stop, constantly pushing them onward, never letting them turn back or scatter. Clara's whole existence shrank down to the next moment, the next breath, just staying on her horse and keeping Luke in her sight. When they finally came out of the high country and into the lower pastures, the storm was still blowing hard, but the worst of the wind was now blocked by the mountains behind them. Luke led the herd into a sheltered valley where they would be safe from the storm, then he turned his weary riders toward home. They finally made it to the ranch long after dark, so cold that Clara could not even feel her own hands when Luke reached up to help her down from her horse. Mrs. Dorsey came hurrying out of the house, took one look at their frozen, exhausted faces, and immediately took charge. "Get inside, all of you. There is hot coffee and food waiting. Luke Mercer, you are bleeding right through your shirt. Do not think for a second I cannot see that. And Clara, child, you look like you are frozen solid." She herded them toward the warmth of the house like they were stray calves. "Tommy, you see to the horses. Miguel, get the other boys settled in the bunkhouse. The rest of you move it." Inside the warm kitchen, Clara's frozen body slowly began to thaw, and with the warmth came the pain. Her hands burned, her feet felt like blocks of ice, and every muscle screamed in protest. Dorsey wrapped her in warm blankets, made her drink hot coffee, and then put a bowl of soup in front of her that she was too tired to even taste. Luke sat at the table while Mrs. Dorsey cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder, scolding him the whole time. "Of all the foolish, reckless things, you could have been killed, and dragging Clara right into that blizzard with you." "She saved the herd," Luke said in a quiet voice. "The hands were spread out around the cattle because I had Clara watching that gap. Without her, the rustlers would have made off with 50 head before we could have done a thing to stop them. He looked over at Clara, his eyes meeting hers across the room. She did the work of any man on that trail. She never complained, she never quit, and she never flinched when things got dangerous. Clara felt a warmth spread across her face, and this time, it had nothing to do with a warming fire. Mrs. Dorsey made a disapproving sound but did not say another word. She finished tending to Luke's shoulder and then shooed Clara off to bed. You need sleep, real sleep, not just a few hours before you have to get up and cook breakfast. I will take care of the morning meal. You sleep until your body tells you it is time to get up. Clara offered no argument. She stumbled into her room, took off her damp, frozen clothes, and climbed into bed. Sleep came for her in an instant, a deep and dreamless state. She woke up to the afternoon sun pouring through her window and the smell of freshly baked bread. Her body was sore in ways that would have frightened her 6 weeks prior, but now it just felt like the normal result of a hard day's work. She got dressed slowly, her joints stiff, and found her way to the kitchen. Mrs. Dorsey glanced up from kneading dough. It is about time. You have been asleep for 16 hours. I'm so sorry. You should have gotten some rest, which is precisely what you did. Sit down. I will get you some food. Clara sat and accepted the plate of eggs, bacon, and toast that Mrs. Dorsey placed in front of her. Through the window, she could see the ranch was covered in a thick blanket of snow. The storm had passed through during the night. Smoke was curling up from the bunkhouse chimney, and she could make out the sounds of men at work in the barn. Luke, she asked, is out checking on the cattle we brought down. His shoulder is sore, but the wound looks clean. It ought to heal up just fine so long as he does not do anything foolish. Mrs. Dorsey poured some coffee and sat down across from Clara, her expression serious. What you did out there, going up into those mountains, working right through the storm, and keeping your head on straight during that attack took real courage. I mean true grit, not the kind you get from being too green to know better, but the kind that comes from looking danger right in the eye and moving forward anyway. Clara just said, I only did what had to be done. That is exactly right. You did what was needed, same as any man on this ranch. Mrs. Dorsey's voice got a little softer. You have changed a whole lot since that first night Luke brought you home. You were a broken thing back then, all hurt and lost and just drowning in your own shame. But you are not that woman any longer. You found something out here in this country, a strength you never even knew you had. Clara thought on that, picturing the woman who stood on that platform back in September and the woman she was right now. Mrs. Dorsey was right. She had changed. The hard work changed her. This land had changed her. And maybe, just maybe, Luke Mercer had changed her too, simply by asking for nothing but an honest day's work. The back door creaked open, and in walked Luke, with snow dust in the brim of his hat and his shoulders. He stopped dead when he saw Clara, and his whole face changed. You are awake? Good. I was starting to get worried. I am fine. I just needed some rest. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on her. Miss Hensley, Clara, I owe you an apology. I never should have taken you into a mess like that. It was a sight more dangerous than I figured, and you could have been badly hurt. Or worse, that would have been on me. You did not make me go, Clara said. I chose to, and I am glad I did. Still, it was reckless of me. Maybe, but it was also necessary. Clara put her fork down, looking him square in the eye. You needed my help, and I was there to give it. I am not some fragile thing, Luke. I am a whole lot stronger than either one of us ever knew. Hearing his first name just hung there in the air between them. Luke's eyes went a little wide, but he did not say a word to correct her. Instead, he just gave a slow nod. You are stronger than most folks I know, man or woman. He stopped for a second, and something in the way he looked at her made Clara's heart beat a little faster. I am glad you are here. Glad you decided to stay. Glad you are a part of this ranch. Before Clara could even think of what to say, Mrs. Dorsey stood up straight. Well, I have got bread in the oven to check on. You two can finish up your coffee. She walked out, and all of a sudden, that big kitchen felt smaller, cozier. Luke set down his cup and moved to the chair across from Clara, his face looking serious. When I found you at that train station, he said in a quiet voice, all I saw was somebody who needed a helping hand. That was it. But now he trailed off, like he was fishing for the right words. Now I see someone who belongs here, someone who fits this life in a way I never would have guessed. And I need you to know that when I look at you, I do not see the woman he left behind. I see the woman you have become. A lump formed in Clara's throat. Thank you, she whispered. That means more to me than you will ever know. They just sat there in the quiet, and his words settled between them like a promise. And right outside the window, the snow kept coming down, covering the whole ranch in white, closing them in and making a world that felt like it was just for them. November blew in with freezing cold and storms that rolled down from the mountains without any warning. The ranch hunkered down into its winter rhythm. The livestock was moved to pastures closer to the barns for shelter. Hay was passed out every day, and ice had to be broken on the water troughs each morning and night. The work never stopped, and it was bone-chilling cold. But Clara had learned to layer up her clothes just like the men. She wrapped herself in wool and oilcloth until she looked more like a walking pile of blankets than a woman. Things between her and Luke had shifted after that cattle drive, though neither of them ever said it out loud. He started seeking her out more, staying for another cup of coffee after supper, asking her what she thought about ranch business, and teaching her how to read the weather signs in the clouds that he watched so close. She found herself looking for him during the day, noticing the moment he rode in from the range, and feeling a little knot in her chest when he was gone longer than she expected. Mrs. Dorsey saw it all. Of course, she never said a word, but Clara caught her knowing glances and little smiles. The housekeeper had even started giving Clara chores that just so happened to put her right where Luke was, like mending that needed doing at the kitchen table while he did his paperwork, or serving meals when he was most likely to stick around and talk. One evening, right in the middle of November, Luke came inside holding a package wrapped in plain brown paper. "This came for you on the supply wagon," he said, and handed it over to Clara. "It is from Chicago." Clara's hands were trembling as she took it. She had written to her parents weeks before, just a short note saying her engagement was over and that she had found work on a ranch out in Montana. She had kept the story simple, not wanting to admit just how bad her shame was, but she needed them to know she was safe. She opened the package alone in her room and found a letter inside a small wooden box. Her mother's neat handwriting filled 2 whole pages. The words were a mix of concern and relief, with a gentle scolding about making foolish choices and the importance of coming back home where she belonged. But at the very end, almost like she did not want to write it, her mother added, "Your father says that if you have found honest work in a respectable place, then maybe the experience will do you some good. But please, write to us more often. We worry." The box held her grandmother's cameo brooch and a little bit of money, $30, her mother wrote, just in case she needed the train fare to get back home. Clara sat on the edge of her bed holding that brooch, remembering her grandmother's fiery spirit and how she had caused a stir in the family by turning down 3 marriage proposals before finally accepting the 4th one, all on her own terms. "Never marry because you are desperate or scared," she had told a young Clara. "You marry because you cannot even imagine your life without that person in it." A soft knock on her door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Clara, you all right in there?" It was Luke's voice, full of concern. She opened the door and found him standing in the hall, with snowflakes melting in his hair and a worried look on his face. "I am fine. Just reading some news from my family." "Good news, I hope." "It is complicated news," she said, showing him the brooch. "It was my grandmother's. I think my mother sent it to remind me of family and to encourage me to come on home." Luke looked closely at the delicate little piece of jewelry. "Are you going to go home?" Clara looked up at him, at the real concern in his eyes, and it hit her with a sudden clearness that Chicago did not feel like home anymore. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "I do not believe I will." A look of relief washed over Luke's face. "I am glad," he said, and then he seemed to catch himself. "I mean, Mrs. Dorsey would be heartbroken to lose your help in the hands. Well, they have all gotten used to your cooking." He cleared his throat. "And Luke," Clara cut off his clumsy rambling with a small smile, "you do not have to find an excuse." He met her gaze, and the air between them suddenly felt thick, heavy with all the things neither of them was brave enough to say. Then he took a step back, and the moment was broken. "I have to ride out tomorrow. Got to check the fence lines before the next storm rolls in. I thought maybe you would want to come along. The work is easier than the cattle drive, and I could surely use the company. I would like that very much, Clara said, and she meant every word of it. They set out right after breakfast, riding east into a clear, cold morning. The land was beautiful in its starkness, just white snow, dark pine trees, and a sky so blue it looked sharp enough to cut. They rode in a comfortable quiet for the first hour. Then Luke started pointing out different landmarks, telling her stories about the land. My uncle built his original cabin right over there, he said, nodding toward a tumble-down shack you could barely see through the trees. He lived alone for 20 years, ran a trap line, and had a few head of cattle. When he passed, he left me this land and $2,000. I was 23 years old and thought I knew everything. He gave a crooked smile. It took me about 6 months to figure out I did not know a single thing about ranching. But you learned, Clara said. I made every mistake a man could possibly make. I lost cattle to wolves, to sickness, and to my own foolishness. I nearly went broke 3 times, but I was just too stubborn to quit. Eventually, I started to figure out what I was doing. He looked over at her. Sometimes I think being stubborn is worth more than being smart out in this country. The smart ones know when it is time to give up. The stubborn ones just keep on going until they either make it or die trying. They stopped around noon to check a stretch of fence, and Luke showed Clara how to find the weak spots and how to fix a break with nothing but wire and a pair of pliers. His hands moved with a purpose, steady and sure. She found herself just watching the way he worked. He was methodical and patient, never rushing, but never wasting a single motion either. You are good at this, she remarked. I have had a lot of practice. What about you? What were you good at back there in Chicago? Clara thought about her old teaching job, the tidy classroom, the carefully planned lessons. It all felt like it belonged to someone else's life now. I taught literature to girls whose parents wanted them to be educated enough to be interesting, but not so educated that they might scare off a potential husband. I read the books they told me to read and gave the opinions I was supposed to give and made sure nobody ever questioned things too much. She paused for a moment. I do not think I was ever very good at it. I was just good at following the rules. And now, well, now I am not sure what I am good at, but I am learning what I am capable of, and that might just be more important. Luke nodded his head slowly. Out here, what you are capable of is what matters most. Qualifications. A man or woman who can pull their own weight, that's what earns respect around here. Everything else is just window dressing. They rode back to the ranch as the afternoon shadows got long, getting there just as Mrs. Dorsey was starting on supper. Clara pitched right in to help, moving around that kitchen like she'd been doing it her whole life, while Luke sat at the table scratching numbers into his account books. It all felt so natural and comfortable, so right in a way Clara never would have guessed. That night, after they'd eaten, Luke pulled out an old chess set. You play? My father taught me a long time ago. I'm pretty rusty. Good, so am I. They set the board up on the kitchen table while Mrs. Dorsey sat knitting by the stove. The first game was slow, each of them feeling the other one out. Clara just barely won, and Luke's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You told me you were rusty. I said I was rusty. Didn't say I was no good. He laughed then. A real, honest-to-goodness laugh, and Clara realized she'd never heard it before. The sound of it did something funny to her insides, made her forget to breathe for a second. They played 3 more games, winning one, then losing one, until Mrs. Dorsey declared she was turning in and said they ought to do the same. Luke walked Clara to her door, and for a moment they just stood there in the hall, neither one quite wanting to say goodnight. I've been thinking, Luke said finally, his voice a little lower now. I have to head back east come December. My mother's taken ill. It ain't serious, but she's asked for me, and I ain't been home in 4 years. I'll probably be gone about 3 weeks. A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. Of course, family is what's important. I was hoping you might keep an eye on things while I'm away. Mrs. Dorsey can handle the house just fine, but the ranch business, I'd trust your good sense on those matters. The foreman, Jack, he's a good man, but he's the kind who likes to have a second opinion when things get tough. Clara just stared at him. You want me to help you run the ranch? I want you to be my partner in this. Not on paper, not in any way that would cause talk, but he ran a hand through his hair, looking a little lost for words. I trust you, Clara. I trust that head on your shoulders, the way you size things up, the way you handle trouble. These last few months, you've shown your worth 100 times over. I can leave this place knowing it'll be in good hands if you're here. That one word settled over her, warm as a blanket. Not just that he trusted her, but that he saw her as a partner. Not just that he accepted her, but that he respected her. I'll do it, she said. Whatever you need done, I'll see to it. A smile spread across Luke's face. His hand lifted like he was about to touch her cheek, but then he let it drop. Thank you. I'll rest a whole lot easier knowing you're here. He left for Kansas that first week of December, and Clara found herself overseeing a ranch she hadn't even known existed 3 months ago. Jack turned out to be as capable and decent as Luke had said, bringing her problems and taking her decisions without a single complaint. The ranch hands got used to her giving directions real quick, especially after she settled a squabble between two of them with the same firm fairness Luke would have used. Mrs. Dorsey watched Clara get more and more sure of herself, and you could see the approval in her eyes. You're taken to this ranch in life like a duck to water. Luke knew what he was doing when he picked you, trusted you with this. I'm just trying to make sure this place is still standing when he gets back, Clara answered. You are doing a whole lot more than that, and you know it. The girl who got off that train all broken and full of desperation, she is long gone. You are someone else now, someone with more grit. Clara found herself thinking on that during the long winter nights. She had journeyed west, chasing some silly notion of adventure and love, following a man who saw her as little more than a convenience for his travels. But in losing that make-believe future, she had stumbled upon something real. She found work that had meaning, respect she had to earn, and a place she could call home. Not because a man allowed her to stay, but because she had proven she deserved to be there. And if she found herself missing Luke with an ache that took her by surprise, if her eyes kept drifting to the road for a rider who was still weeks away, if she stayed awake at night remembering the look he gave her in the hallway that evening, well, those were her own private thoughts to keep. Luke came back 3 days before Christmas, appearing in the middle of a snowstorm with 2 pack horses heavy with supplies. Clara was in the barn, checking on a mare that was about to foal when she heard the noise. She stepped out into the swirling snow and saw him swinging down from his horse, and her heart did a little flip in her chest. He spotted her and gave that rare smile that changed his whole face. Hello, Clara. Welcome home. How was the trip? Long, cold, and it made me grateful for a Montana winter, which is really saying something. He passed her the reins to his horses. Tommy, he gave a nod and asked, how have things been holding up here? Clara stood a little taller. Still standing, we lost a couple of calves to wolves, but Jack tracked that pack and ran them clear north. We had a bit of a mess when a pipe burst, but Miguel got it patched right up, and Mrs. Dorsey's been showing me how to make her bread. The hands say mine is almost as good as hers now. Luke listened to every word she said, and a warmth spread across his face. I knew I could count on you. Jack sent me a letter halfway through the drive. He said you'd earned the respect of every hand here, and then some. They started walking toward the house together, and Clara filled him in on all the little details of the past 3 weeks. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Dorsey fussed over Luke, piling his plate with food and scolding him for looking too thin. All the while, Clara made coffee and tried her best not to stare at him like a woman starved for the sight of his face. That evening, long after supper was done, Luke asked Clara to join him in the parlor. He held out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. This is for you. I saw it in Kansas City and it made me think of you. Clara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal with clean, empty pages and a handsome fountain pen. A lump formed in her throat. I remember you mentioned you wanted to write, Luke said softly, about your experiences out here. I thought you might like something proper to write in. Luke, this is far too much. It's not nearly enough, he countered, for what you've done here, for what you've come to mean to this place. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more serious. Clara, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right words since the day I left, and I'm still not sure these are them. but I just cannot keep it inside any longer. Clara's heart started to beat like a drum against her ribs. What is it? When I first found you at that train station, he began, I told myself I was just helping a person in trouble. That is what I told Mrs. Dorsey. It is what I told the hands. It is what I told myself every single day for the first month you were here. He looked directly into her eyes. But somewhere down the line, it turned into more than that. Watching you work, seeing you get stronger and more sure of yourself, talking with you in the evenings. Clara, you've become the backbone of this place for me, not just for the ranch, but for my life. And I realized while I was gone that I do not want to run this place without you. I do not want to live my life without you. Clara felt like she could not breathe. She could not think about anything beyond the pounding in her chest and the wild hope that was blooming inside her. I know it is complicated, Luke continued, his voice earnest. I know you came here running from a broken engagement, and the last thing you probably want is another man making you promises. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is not pity or convenience or anything but the simple truth. The truth is that I have fallen in love with you, and I cannot picture a future that does not have you in it. The words hung in the quiet room between them, raw and honest and a little bit terrifying. Clara just stared at him, this man who had saved her without ever asking for a thing in return. This man who had seen her at her absolute lowest and believed she could be strong. The one who had trusted her with his home, his ranch, and now with his heart. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not have to say anything tonight. I just needed you to know, I needed you to understand that when I look at you, I see my partner. I see my equal. I see the woman I want standing beside me for whatever comes our way. He stood up as if to leave and give her space. Think on it. Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere. But Clara stood up too, her hand reaching out to catch his sleeve. Luke, wait. He turned back, and she could see both hope and fear in his eyes. I need to tell you something too, Clara said, her voice growing stronger with every word. When I came here, I was a broken woman. I thought I knew what I wanted out of life. Security, respectability, a life that looked perfect from the outside. But I had built all my dreams on a foundation of lies. And when it all came crashing down, I thought I had lost everything. She took a step closer to him, her hand still resting on his arm. But I did not lose everything. I found something real. I found work that matters, and I found respect that I earned with my own two hands. I found a place where I finally belong. And I found you, a man who sees me for who I actually am, not for who I should be or could be, but for who I am right now, a man who trusts me with real responsibility and a real partnership, a man who makes me want to be brave enough to take what I truly want instead of just settling for what feels safe. Luke's eyes darkened, and he drew in a sharp breath. Luke, I love you, she said, the words simple and clear. I do not know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was that first night when you stopped at the station, or maybe it was during the cattle drive when I saw the real man you are, or maybe it was in all the quiet moments in between. But I love you, Luke Mercer, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it either. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her so tight against his chest that she could feel his heart beating. He buried his face in her hair, and Clara wrapped her arms around his strong back. She felt the solid realness of him, the warmth and the strength, and the absolute certainty that this, right here, was what she had been searching for all along. When he finally drew back, his eyes were shining. Marry me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not because you need a safe place to land, or because you have nowhere else to go. Marry me because you want to build a life here with me. Be my wife, my partner, my equal in everything. Yes, Clara said, laughing and crying all at the same time. Yes, absolutely, yes. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the polite, passionless kisses Grant had given her in fancy Chicago parlors. This was fire and promise, and a fierce, wild joy. It was the kind of kiss that said, you are mine and I am yours, and nothing in this world will ever change that. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. I will do everything in my power to make you happy, Clara, to give you the life you deserve. You already have, she said softly, just by seeing me, by trusting me, and by loving me exactly as I am. They stood together in the warm lamplight while snow fell gently outside the window and the fire crackled in the hearth, holding each other and making quiet promises about the future they would build together. And in that moment, Clara understood that being abandoned at the Willow Creek station was not the end of her story. It was the very beginning of something far better than anything she could have ever dreamed up. The next morning at breakfast, Luke cleared his throat and made an announcement. Mrs. Dorsey, I have some news. Clara has agreed to marry me, Miss Up. Dorsey set down her coffee cup with a loud thump. Well, it is about time. I was starting to think you two had lost your minds, dancing around each other for all these months. But her eyes were misty as she pulled Clara into a warm hug. Welcome to the family, child. Officially this time. The hands took the news with wide grins and hearty congratulations, and Tommy let out a loud whoop that made the horses in the corral jump. Jack shook Luke's hand with a serious expression. You picked a good one, boss. She is good people. Clara spent the rest of the day in a happy daze going through her usual chores while her mind replayed every moment of the night before. She was engaged again, but this time it was completely different. This time it was to a man who knew her, truly knew her, and loved her anyway. A man she had chosen not out of desperation or some girlish fantasy, but out of a real partnership and respect and a love so fierce it sometimes took her breath away. That evening, she sat in her room writing in the beautiful journal Luke had given her. She tried to capture the incredible journey that had taken her from that desperate September afternoon to this wonderful December night. She wrote about the fear and the shame and the feeling of being utterly alone. She wrote about hard work and earned respect and the surprising grace she had found here. She wrote about discovering that she was stronger than she had ever believed, braver than she had ever hoped, and more capable than anyone, including herself, had ever told her she could be. And she wrote about Luke. She wrote about the way he had seen her potential when she could not see it herself. She wrote about his patience and his trust, and about a love that asked her to become her very best self, rather than a smaller version of herself designed to please someone else. A soft knock on the door interrupted her writing. Luke stood at the doorway, and the look on his face made her put down her pen. I just wanted to see you, he said quietly, to make sure last night was real, and that I did not just dream the whole thing up. Clara stood and walked over to him, taking both of his hands in hers. It is real. I am real. This is real. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the quiet room, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside and the old house settling for the night. Tomorrow would bring more work and bitter cold, and all the usual challenges of winter on a Montana ranch. But tonight they had this. They had the certainty of being chosen, of being truly seen, and of being loved for exactly who they were. And then, on December 20th, everything changed. Clara was in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house, coming in way too fast for a casual visitor. She stepped outside just in time to see a rider she did not recognize pounding up the trail, his horse covered in lather and breathing hard. He pulled his horse to a rough stop when he saw Luke coming from the paddock. Mercer? You Luke Mercer? I am. What is wrong? The rider's face was grim. The Roar brothers. They broke out of jail in Billings 3 days ago. The sheriff sent me to warn you. They are headed this way, and they are looking for revenge for their cousin. Clara's blood ran cold. She remembered the rustler who had fallen during the cattle drive, the one Luke had been forced to shoot when they tried to steal the herd. Luke's expression turned to stone. How many of them? 3 of them. They are armed and they are dangerous. The sheriff is deputizing men and riding out, but they will not make it here before nightfall. And the Roars could show up at any time. The rider looked around nervously. The sheriff warned Ford, get your men armed and do not let them catch you with your guard down. These are not simple thieves. They are killers, and they are looking to settle a score with blood. Luke looked at Clara. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. Get inside the house. You stay with Mrs. Dorsey. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Luke, please, Clara started. I cannot fight them if I am worried sick about you. His voice had a slight tremor. Please, She wanted to argue, to stand right there by his side, but she saw the fear in his eyes. It was not for himself, but for her, and she gave a small nod. Be careful. I surely intend to. He kissed her, hard and fast. I love you, you remember that. Then he was moving, yelling out orders. Jack, bring the rifles from the house. Miguel, Tommy, Pete, get your weapons and find positions around the property. Nobody sets foot on this ranch unless they go through us first. Clara ran toward the house where Mrs. Dorsey was already loading shotguns, her hands shaking. I heard, the housekeeper said, her voice grim. We will be ready if they make it past the men. They waited as the afternoon bled into evening, peering through the windows, watching the ranch hands take their places around the ranch. Luke was positioned near the barn, rifle in hand, his face a mask of calm focus. The pregnant mare whinnied, sensing the thick tension in the air. Complete darkness had fallen when Clara spotted movement on the trail. 3 riders coming up slow and steady, not even trying to be quiet. The Roar brothers had arrived for their revenge, and they did not care who was watching. Luke stepped forward into the yard, his rifle held ready but not pointed. That is far enough. This is private property. The rider in the lead, a large man with a scarred face, spat onto the ground. You must be Luke Mercer. You are the one who killed our cousin. Your cousin was trying to steal my cattle. He drew his gun on me first. That does not matter now. He is dead, and somebody has to pay for it. We can make it quick and clean, or we can burn this whole place to the ground with everyone inside. The choice is yours. Clara watched in absolute horror as the situation got worse. The 3 men swung down from their horses, their weapons already drawn, and began to spread out in the yard. Luke held his ground, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. The ranch hands were moving into place, but the Roars were expecting them. And then everything just exploded into pure chaos. Gunshots cracked through the night like thunder. The flash from the muzzles lit up the darkness in sharp, sudden bursts. Clara saw Jack fall first, grabbing at his leg, and a wave of terror washed over her. The Roars were not here to talk. They had come to kill everyone Luke cared about, to burn his entire life to the ground, just as they believed he had done to theirs. Luke dove for cover behind a water trough, firing back as bullets ripped splinters from the wood. Miguel and Pete were pinned down over by the barn, unable to get any decent shots without being exposed. Tommy had vanished around the side of the bunkhouse, and Clara prayed he was trying to get a better angle and not just running away. The lead Roar, the one with the scarred face, walked across the yard like a man who was certain he had already won. His brothers laid down covering fire, and Luke was unable to get a clear shot without being hit himself. Clara watched with growing dread. The scarred man got closer and closer to where Luke was hiding, his rifle aimed right at the water trough. Come on out, Mercer, the man hollered. Let's make this easy. Just you in exchange for all of them. That seems fair, does it not? There is nothing fair about any of this, Roar, Luke yelled back. Your cousin chose his own path. He knew the risks when he decided to steal from me. Maybe so, but he was family, and blood has to be answered with blood. The scarred man fired, and the bullet tore right through the trough. Water started pouring out, and Clara realized with a sickening feeling that Luke's only cover was being taken away, piece by piece. Mrs. Dorsey grabbed Clara's arm, her voice filled with urgency. We have to do something. They are going to kill him. Clara's mind was racing. Luke had told her to stay inside, to be safe, but watching him die from a window was not safety. It was being a coward, and if she had learned anything over the past few months, it was that she might be many things, but a coward was not one of them. Where are the extra rifles, she asked. Mrs. Dorsey's eyes went wide. Clara, no, in the closet. But child, you cannot. Clara was already on her feet. She pulled a rifle from the closet, checked to make sure it was loaded, just like Miguel had shown her on the cattle drive, and moved to the front window. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was perfectly clear. She was not a good enough shot to hit the Roars from this distance, but she could create a distraction. She could give Luke and the other men a chance to move. She pushed open the window and took aim at the dirt near her. Clara fired a shot right at the dirt by the youngest Roar brother's boots. Dust flew and the boy hollered, hopping backward and spinning around, trying to figure out where the shot came from. That got his brother's attention, and for a split second, they forgot all about Luke. It was the chance Luke had been waiting for. He scrambled out from behind the splintered water trough, dropped to one knee, and let off two quick shots. One of the brothers hit the ground hard, grabbing at his shoulder. The scarred-up leader let out a furious roar and swung his rifle toward the house, right at the window where Clara's shot had come from. "No!" Luke's voice was ragged with pure fear. He charged straight across the open yard, drawing their fire and making himself the target to protect the house. Miguel and Pete took their cue, and their own gunfire forced the last roar to duck for cover behind his horse. Clara shot again, not trying to hit anyone, just trying to keep them pinned down so the ranch hands could move up. Mrs. Dorsey was right there beside her with another rifle, and the two of them laid down a crossfire the roars never saw coming. But that scarred leader was as cunning as a coyote and twice as desperate. While his brother kept Luke and the hands busy, he slipped away, using the dark and the chaos to sneak around toward the barn. Clara caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, but it was too late. She saw him vanish into the shadows right by the big doors, and then she smelled it. Smoke. He set the barn on fire. Tommy's voice cracked with panic. "The mayor is in there, the pregnant mayor!" That old barn was nothing but dry timber, ready to go up like a torch. Flames were already chewing on the hay bales by the entrance, and thick, black smoke was pouring out. The smoke billowed thick and black. In the corral, the other horses were screaming and kicking at the fences, wild with fear from the smell of the fire. Luke spun around and saw the flames, and Clara could see the awful choice playing out right across his face. Should he keep fighting the roars, or should he save the barn and all the animals inside? The mare alone was worth 6 months of profit, and her foal was the future of his entire breeding program. But to save that horse, he would have to turn his back on men with guns who were trying to kill him. Just then the scarred roar stepped out of the smoke, his rifle aimed square at Luke's back. He was grinning, sure he had already won. Luke had to make a choice, his life or his livelihood. No matter what he picked, the roars would win. Clara did not hesitate. She just moved. She flew out the door of the house and sprinted across the yard before Mrs. Dorsey even had a chance to stop her. The rifle felt heavy in her arms, and her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break right through. She could see the scarred man's finger tightening on the trigger. She could see Luke turning toward the burning barn, with no idea of the danger right behind him. "Luke," she screamed, "get down!" He hit the dirt without a second thought, trusting her completely. Clara brought the rifle to her shoulder. She had never fired a gun at a person before, had never even aimed a weapon at a living thing, meaning to cause it harm. But this man was about to kill Luke, was about to destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. And she was not about to let that happen. She pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked hard against her shoulder. The shot went wide and missed the scarred man, but it was close enough to make him jump and turn. His eyes found her. His eyes locked onto her from across the smoke-filled yard, and his face changed from pure confidence to shock and then to pure rage. He whipped his rifle around to aim at her, and Clara knew with a cold certainty that her life was over. She had bought Luke a few precious seconds, maybe even saved his life, but now her own time was running out with every beat of her heart. The scarred man's rifle cracked through the night, but Clara felt no pain. Instead, she heard a second shot. She saw the man stumble, and then she saw Luke standing right behind him, a smoking rifle in his hand and murder in his eyes. The scarred roar fell to his knees and then pitched face first into the dirt. Miguel and Pete had the youngest brother covered. He had his hands up in the air, giving up with their rifles aimed right at him. But the barn was still burning. Flames were climbing higher and higher, and the whole building groaned as its support beams began to fail. The mayor. Luke took off for the barn, and Claire was right behind him. A wave of heat hit them as they got closer. The smoke was so thick, it felt like it was scorching their lungs. Inside, the mare was screaming, trapped in her stall and panicking as the fire ate up the hay all around her. Luke grabbed a horse blanket, dunked it in the water trough until it was soaking wet, and threw it over his head and shoulders. "You stay back, Clara. That roof could collapse at any second. Then you are not going in there by yourself." Clara snatched another blanket, soaked it through, and wrapped it all around herself. Together they charged into the burning barn. The heat was so fierce Clara could feel her skin pulling tight. The smoke was so thick she could not see more than a few feet in front of her face. The mayor was rearing and kicking, just too terrified to understand they were there to help. They were just trying to do some good. Luke eased forward, talking in that low and steady voice he always used on spooked animals. Easy now, girl. Just take it easy. We're fixing to get you out. He managed to get a rope over the mare's neck as Clara swung the stall gate wide open. The horse shot out of there like a cannonball, nearly running them both over in her desperation. They scrambled out after her just as a big section of the roof gave way, sending a spray of embers into the dark sky like 1,000 angry fireflies. Outside, the ranch hands had already formed a bucket line, hauling water from the well and slinging it at the blaze. It wasn't nearly enough to save the barn, but it might keep the flames from jumping to the other buildings. Clara fell into the line, passing buckets down until her arms felt like lead and her lungs burned from all the smoke. It took 2 long hours before the fire was finally wrestled under control. By that time, the barn was just a heap of smoking timbers, with collapsed beams glowing like hot coals in the night. The mare had been cornered and put in a paddock, still shaking but safe. Jack's leg was all wrapped up. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle and missed the bone. The Roar brother, who was still breathing, had been tied up good and put in the bunkhouse with a guard, while his dead kin lay under blankets right where they fell. Luke stood right in the middle of all the ruin, his face streaked with soot and plain worn out, just staring at the wreck of his barn with a look Clara couldn't quite figure out. She walked over to him slowly, her own face and clothes blackened by the smoke, her hands covered in blisters from the bucket handles. Luke. He turned and she saw clean tracks where tears had cut right through the grime on his cheeks, streaming down his soot-covered face. You could have been killed. When I saw you run out into the open like that, when I saw that scoundrel level his gun at you, his voice hitched. Clara, you could have died right there, but I did not. And neither did you. That is what counts. You saved my life. He pulled her into a hug so tight she felt her ribs might crack. That single moment you hollered at me, if you had not, he would have put a bullet straight in my back. You saved my hide, and then you went and nearly got yourself killed for it. Clara hugged him back, feeling him tremble against her. I was not about to let him shoot you. I could not just stay hidden and watch you die. You were supposed to be safe. That was the entire plan, to keep you safe, I know. But somewhere along the line, keeping you breathing became a whole lot more important than me being safe. She leaned back to see his face, to see the fierce need to protect her and the sheer terror still swimming in his eyes. We are partners, are we not? That means I stand right here with you, not cowering behind you, especially when it gets dangerous. Luke cradled her face with his hands, his touch so gentle despite his rough, callous skin. You are the bravest woman I have ever known, and you scare the daylights out of me. And I love you so much it makes my chest ache. I love you too, Clara said, barn and all. He let out a laugh, a rough and shaky sound, but it was real. The barn can be replaced. You cannot. The sheriff rode in at sunup with about a dozen deputized men. They took the last Roar brother into custody and carried away the bodies. He listened to what everyone had to say, his face getting stonier as he heard the whole story. You did what you had to do, he told Luke. It was self-defense, clear as a blue sky. And miss, he said, turning to Clara, that was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I have ever witnessed, running out there like that. But you saved lives last night. There is no question about that. Are there going to be charges? Luke asked. Against you? Not a chance. Against the Roars? If that third one makes it to trial? The sheriff's smile was pure ice. Oh, there will be charges, all right. Arson, attempted murder, assault. He will either hang or spend the rest of his days in a territorial prison. One way or another, you will not have any more trouble from that family. Once the lawmen left, the hands started the long job of cleaning up the mess and tending to the spooked animals. Mrs. Dorsey cooked up giant platters of eggs and bacon for everyone, even though breakfast time was long gone. The kitchen soon filled with tired men who had just lived through a night they would never forget. Luke sat close to Clara, their fingers laced together under the table. He had not let go of her since the gunfire ended. Like touching her was the only way he could believe she was still there and in one piece. Every few minutes he would squeeze her hand and she would squeeze right back. It was a whole conversation without a single word. When do you reckon we can rebuild? Clara asked as they looked over the damage in the daylight. Probably in the spring. We have to wait for the ground to thaw to lay a proper foundation. Luke's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. Things will be tight until then. We will have to put the livestock to a stall in the buildings we have left, and we will have to buy hay since we lost our whole supply. But we will figure it out. We always do. We, Clara repeated, her voice soft. I like the sound of that. Luke turned to her, and even surrounded by all that destruction, even after they both nearly died, his eyes were full of warmth. Clara Hensley, I know this is not a romantic way to do this, standing in the ashes of my barn with soot in our hair and the smell of death still in the air, but I am not waiting another minute. Marry me this week, right here at the ranch, with the hands as our witnesses and with Mrs. Dorsey crying, which I know she will. No fancy church, no big to-do, just you and me making promises we both know are for keeps. Clara's throat felt tight with emotion. This week. Why should we wait? We have already been through fire together. Literally, I want you as my wife, my partner, my equal in everything. I want it legal and official and forever, so that nobody can ever say you do not belong here. So everyone knows this is your home just as much as it is mine. He pulled her closer. Say yes, Clara. Please just say yes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, absolutely, yes. This week, this month, this very minute. I do not care when, as long as it is you and me. They were married 4 days later on Christmas Eve, right in the parlor of the main house. The justice of the peace had ridden all the way from town. Clara wore her best dress, the gray wool one she had arrived in, all cleaned and mended, with her grandmother's little cameo pinned to the collar. Luke wore a suit that looked a bit stiff on his rancher's body, but his eyes never once left her face through the whole short ceremony. Mrs. Dorsey cried, just like Luke predicted she would, and the hands got themselves cleaned up remarkably well in pressed shirts with their hair slicked back. They all stood as witnesses while Clara and Luke spoke their vows, promising to be partners who respected and loved each other through whatever troubles this land sent their way. When the justice declared them husband and wife, Luke kissed Clara with a tenderness that made her own eyes sting with happy tears. This was not anything like the life she had pictured for herself when she stepped on that train in Chicago. It was harder, it was wilder, it was less certain in every possible way, but it was real, and it was hers, and she would not trade it for anything in the world. The hands had decorated the house with pine boughs and sprigs of wild holly. Mrs. Dorsey had baked a cake that surely broke all the rules of wartime sugar rationing, but it tasted like a piece of heaven. They ate and drank coffee and swapped stories, and for a few hours the burned-down barn and the dead men and the awful violence of that night all seemed to fade away. That evening, long after everyone else had turned in, Clara and Luke stood on the porch, watching the snow come down, soft and quiet over the ranch. Luke had his arm wrapped around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling more peaceful than she ever thought a person could be. Do you ever regret it? Luke asked in a low voice. Coming west? I mean, ending up here instead of having whatever life you would have had back east. Clara thought about Grant Caldwell, about the kind of woman she was when she first followed him out west. So green, so desperate, building a whole future on a bed of lies. She thought about all those months of back-breaking work, the thick calluses on her palms, and how her body had firmed up with real strength from all that labor. She thought about learning to handle a horse and a rifle, how to run a ranch, and about winning the respect of fellows who cared more about what you could do than what you looked like. But most of all, her thoughts turned to Luke. She thought about how he had rescued her without ever making her feel small, and how he saw the potential in her long before she ever saw it in herself. She thought about the partnership they had forged from honesty, mutual respect, and a love that grew slow and steady, like a wild thing with roots so deep you could never pull it up. No, she said, her voice solid as an oak. I don't regret a single bit of it, not even the tough times, especially not the tough times, because they're what showed me who I truly am. And just who is that, Clara Mercer? Luke's voice had a warm smile in it when he used her new name. Someone a heck of a lot stronger than I ever knew. Someone braver than I ever dared to hope. Someone who found her home in the very last place she ever thought to look. She shifted in his arms, tilting her head back to see his face in the soft moonlight. I'm someone who loves you more than anything in this world. Luke gently kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, and finally her lips. You are the finest thing that ever happened to me. I swear it. The day you stepped off that train, looking all lost and hopeless. That was the luckiest day of my entire life. Mine too, Clara whispered, even if I was too stubborn to know it then. They stayed out on that porch until the chill finally chased them indoors, and then they went up the stairs to the bedroom they would now share from this night on. Clara's little room with its tiny bed was empty now, her small collection of belongings having been moved into Luke's more spacious room. It felt like a symbol of something bigger. She had outgrown that small space, just as she had outgrown the scared, smaller version of herself that had hidden away in there during those first few frightening nights. Winter settled in deep across the land, and life on the ranch found a new rhythm. The charred ruins of the barn were cleared away, with any good lumber saved for the wood stove, and the foundation marked for rebuilding come spring. The ranch hands adjusted to the tighter quarters, and the livestock were managed in the crowded remaining buildings. It was certainly harder, but everyone pitched in together, and that sense of unity somehow made the burden easier to carry. Clara dove headfirst into learning every single thing she could about managing a ranch. Luke showed her how to read the ledgers, how to figure out profit margins and project costs, and how to make the tough calls about when to buy, sell, or hold. She found out she had a real knack for numbers, seeing patterns and possibilities that Luke sometimes overlooked because he was so wrapped up in the day-to-day work. They truly became a team, with each of them bringing their own unique strengths to the table. Luke knew the land, the cattle, and the hard physical work of ranching like the back of his hand. Clara, on the other hand, understood planning, organization, and the kind of long-term thinking that her years of formal education had given her. Together, they were far more capable than either one of them could have ever been alone. Spring finally broke through with a mess of mud and melting snow, bringing with it the exhausting work of calving season. Clara learned how to help with complicated births, how to bottle feed calves that had lost their mothers, and how to spot the first signs of illness before they turned into a full-blown crisis. Her hands got rougher, her shoulders grew broader, and her face became more weathered by the sun and the wind, and honestly, she had never felt happier in her life. The new barn went up in no time once the weather turned for the better, built even bigger and stronger than the first one with money Luke had been tucking away for years. The hands all worked with a genuine energy. Every one of them felt invested in the ranch's future because Luke always treated them like partners, not just hired men. On the day they hoisted the mainframe into place, Clara stood right beside Luke, watching the whole structure come to life, and she felt a powerful surge of pride fill her chest. We did this, Luke said in a low voice. You and me, we took an absolute disaster and made something even better out of it. That's starting to feel like our specialty, Clara noted, taking the worst thing possible and turning it into something worth having. By the time summer rolled in, the barn was complete and the ranch was doing better than ever. The mare that Clara and Luke had rescued from the fire gave birth to a strong, healthy colt that would become the cornerstone of their new breeding program. The cattle were plump and healthy, the market prices were high, and for the very first time since he had inherited the land, Luke ended the year with a solid profit. One evening in late June, Clara was standing inside what used to be the ranch's old, forgotten schoolhouse, a small building near the main house that the previous owner's wife had built and was left to decay after she passed. Clara had spent the last month cleaning it out, fixing the old desks, giving the walls a fresh coat of whitewash, and gathering up books. Luke found her there, neatly arranging primers on a bookshelf. "What in the world is all this?" he asked. "You remember how I told you there wasn't a school for the ranch kids anywhere in this area?" "Well, I have been thinking. We have this building right here, we have the room, and I have experience as a teacher. The Bartlett family, about 20 miles east of here, has 3 children. The Jensens have 4. Even with the distances, I reckon I could bring together about 8 or 10 students if their folks knew there was a choice." She turned to look him in the eye. "I want to teach again, Luke, not because I have to, but because I truly want to. Because those kids deserve a good education, and I have these skills that are just going to waste." Luke glanced around the newly transformed room, a thoughtful look on his face. You would have to run the house and teach at the same time. That is a mighty big workload. I know, but Mrs. Dorsey and I have the house running like a well-oiled machine now and teaching for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. I can handle that, Clara, if you are willing to let me give it a shot. Luke reached out and took her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. You do not need my permission for anything. This is your life too, your home too. It is your decision to make. If you want to teach, then you should teach. I will back you up 100%. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss full of gratitude and fire. Thank you for letting me be more than just a rancher's wife. You could never be just anything, Luke said. You are far too remarkable for that. The school opened its doors in September, exactly 1 year to the day after Clara had first set foot in Montana. She had 9 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, the children of neighboring ranchers who rode in every morning and stayed until the early afternoon. She taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and literature. Real literature, not the watered-down stuff she had to teach back in Chicago, but honest-to-goodness books that made them ask questions and really think. The children absolutely adored her, and their parents were deeply grateful. Clara soon realized that teaching out here, where an education was treasured because it was so hard to come by, was a million times more rewarding than teaching a bunch of bored, wealthy girls who only went to school because it was what was expected of them. She would come home each afternoon and find Luke busy with the account books, or mending a piece of equipment, or talking over plans with the hands. They would have supper together, sharing stories about their day, making choices about the ranch, the school, and their life ahead. Some nights they would play a game of chess by the warm glow of a lamp. Other nights they would just sit together and read, perfectly content in the comfortable silence between them. On the anniversary of the day Clara had been left all alone at the Willow Creek station, Luke reached for her hand across the breakfast table. His face was serious, almost solemn. Do you have any idea what day it is? He asked her. September 15th, Clara said. 1 year since the best thing that ever happened to me wandered into my life. Luke gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Clara, I want you to know something, and I need you to really listen to what I am saying. You have a home here with me, not because you need one, and not because you have nowhere else on earth to go, but because this is right where you belong. This ranch, this life, this partnership, it is all yours forever. No matter what happens, no matter how tough things might get, you will always have a place here. You will always have me. Clara's eyes started to burn with unshed tears. She thought about the terrified woman who had stood on that train platform, absolutely certain that her life was over. She thought about all the ways she had grown and transformed, about the inner strength she had found, and the love she had truly earned. I know, she said, her voice soft. And Luke, you have me too, forever. That is a promise. They just sat there as the morning sunshine poured into the kitchen, holding hands across the old wooden table. 2 people who had stumbled upon each other in the wreckage of their broken dreams and had built something far stronger than either of them could have ever imagined. Outside, the ranch was humming with the sounds of the day. The hands were starting their chores. The horses were stirring in the corrals. The brand new barn stood tall and solid against the wide Montana sky. Clara had come out west chasing some foolish fantasy and had found a solid reality instead. She had lost the life she had so carefully planned, only to discover the life she was always meant to live. She had been cast aside by a man who was never worthy of her and found by a man who saw her true value from the very start. And every morning when she woke up next to Luke in their bed, every afternoon when she saw the look of understanding light up her students' faces, every evening when she stood on the porch and watched the sun dip below the horizon over land that was as much hers as it was his, she felt a deep gratitude for that September day when her old life came to an end and her real life truly began. The ranch flourished, the school grew, Clara and Luke faced down droughts and bitter winters, good years and lean ones. They were always together, always partners in every single way that mattered. They built a life that was hard and genuine and incredibly precious, proving with each passing day that the very best things often rise from the ashes of the very worst moments. And that sometimes being left behind is just what you need to be set free to find where you truly belong. And on those quiet evenings when Luke would pull her in close and whisper, "You have got a home with me forever," Clara would smile and always answer, "I know, and you have got one with me too," because that is what they had built together. It was not just a ranch or a marriage, but a true home in every sense of the word, a place where they were both seen, both cherished, and both loved for exactly who they were. And there was not a single thing in the whole wide world more valuable than that.